In this episode, we dive into a journey that spans thousands of years of history, not just through the lens of noble ancestry, but with a focus on the scientific process of historical research. As we explore the connections between my family's lineage, the lords of Arkle, and peoples like the Sicambrians and even the Trojans, this isn't a simple story of family pride or noble blood. It's a story of inquiry, of hypothesis, and of historical detective work. Across 60 episodes, this Dutch DNA series explores a lineage carried across time like a signal through the noise of history. Each episode forms a tile in a larger mosaic, connecting one present-day Dutch family with ancient roots that trace back to the peoples of Troy, Shechem, and Aksum. The aim isn't to romanticize the past, but to map the paths of migration, resilience, and cultural inheritance. It's about remembering rivers crossed, exiles endured, structures built, and futures imagined. Episode 14 revisits the time of Joincus of the Dardanelles and the founding of Scupi, also known as Sicambria. We examine how both conflict and cooperation molded a people, and how, centuries later, the symbolic fire of Troy continued to burn, not in cities, but in the bloodline. This is their story. This is our origin. Before states, before geography as we know it, and even before historical records named kings, there were rivers. They carved paths across the land, transmitting not only water, but also people, languages, and early forms of social structure. That's where this story begins, not in the Netherlands, nor in Germania, but in the cultural aftershock of Troy's fall. The tale centers on a largely forgotten population, the Sicambrians, and a prince named Joincus of the Dardanelles, who is said to descend from Trojan and Dardanian ancestors. The narrative blends oral traditions, medieval chronicles, and emerging DNA evidence. Among the sources, the 12th century chronicles of Arkle describe an early patriarch, Joincus, whose name surfaces subtly in the recorded genealogies of Frankish nobility. Like Aeneas, Joincus was a survivor. Following the collapse of Troy, he led a group of warriors and nobles into exile. Their journey took them across the Aegean Sea and eventually up the Vardar River, into what was then known as Dardania, a region of mountainous forests and ancient sanctuaries. The last night in Troy is said to have burned like the core of a dying star. Smoke thickened the air. The city howled with human loss and structural collapse. On the heights of the citadel, Joincus, helmet charred and gaze locked on the destruction, watched the ancestral temples burn. The dynasty of Dardanelles was not extinguished quietly. He wasn't the only one who escaped. Others fled too, scholars, priests, warriors, carrying with them sacred artifacts, oral traditions, and family identities rooted in generations past. Though the Greeks won the battle, they didn't erase the lineage. Nor did they silence the memory. And so began a long period of migration. At the heart of ancient Trojan tradition stands the story of the Dardanians, a noble and resilient people whose origins predate the founding of Troy itself. According to ancient Greek sources, notably Homer's Iliad, the Dardanians were ruled by their own royal line, distinct yet closely related to the Trojan kings. The mythical founder of the Dardanian people was Dardanelles, a figure said to be the son of Zeus and Electra. Legends vary on his place of origin, ranging from Samothrace to Arcadia or even Italy, but consistently portray Dardanelles as the builder of Dardania, a city and region on the slopes of Mount Ida, located near what would later become Troy. His descendants, through Tros and others, would lay the genealogical foundation for both the Trojan and Dardanian royal houses. Homer's Iliad consistently distinguishes the Dardanians as an allied but semi-independent people, suggesting a political reality in which the Dardanian princes maintained sovereignty, even while supporting their Trojan relatives. The Dardanians, though culturally similar to the Trojans, speaking the same language and worshipping the same gods, were often characterized as hardier and more rural, reflecting their mountainous homeland. Their identity as a separate but allied power highlights the complex political landscape of the Troad in the Late Bronze Age. Beyond myth, there is another Dardania, a historical region located in the Central Balkans, covering parts of modern Kosovo, southern Serbia, and northern North Macedonia. This historical Dardania emerges clearly in records from the classical period onward, inhabited by a real tribal people known as the Dardanelles. The relationship between the mythical Anatolian Dardanians and the historical Balkan Dardanelles has been the subject of scholarly inquiry since antiquity. Ancient geographers like Strabo speculated about a connection due to the shared name. Modern mainstream scholarship generally concludes that although the similarity of names is striking, a direct descent of the Balkan Dardanelles from the Trojan Dardanians cannot be conclusively proven. However, a number of scholars, particularly from Albanian and broader Balkan traditions, argue for a much closer historical connection between the Dardanians of Troy and the Illyrians of the Balkans. These theories are based on linguistic similarities between early Illyrian and proposed Trojan languages, archaeological findings showing cultural continuities across the Adriatic and Aegean regions during the Bronze Age, and oral traditions and legends suggesting migrations from the Aegean northward into the Balkans following the collapse of Troy. According to these interpretations, the Dardanians of the Balkans could indeed be direct descendants of the Anatolian Dardanians, having migrated northward after the destruction of Troy, blending with or forming a core part of the early Illyrian population. Some proponents even view the entire Illyrian identity as carrying strong echoes of ancient Trojan civilization. Thus, while the dominant academic view holds that the Dardanian princes of Troy and the historical Balkan Dardanelles developed independently after deep prehistoric splits, there remains a compelling alternative theory that they are directly related through ancient migrations and cultural survivals. It is in this context, shaped by intertwined myth, memory, migration, and ongoing scholarly debate, that we now introduce Joincus. A Dardanian prince whose story embodies the lasting spirit of Dardania across both Asia Minor and the Balkans, linking heroic tradition with the emerging realities of a new age. Like Aeneas, Joincus didn't head west to Italy, but instead followed older prophecies. These spoke of rivers and iron, of future cities forged in fire. The fleet pushed north and east, seeking terrain where their people could rebuild. The voyage wasn't easy. Storms scattered ships. Pirates tested their defenses. Some lives were lost to water, some to hunger or mutiny. But those who stayed with Joincus pressed on. They navigated river mouths and inland currents, Axios, Morava, Vardar, guided more by instinct than by map. Their route crossed territories filled with new threats, forest tribes ambushing travelers, hunters with wolf pelts and painted faces. This migration became a generational trial. They left signs of their passing, carved symbols of Troy on bark and stone. They buried their fallen under marked trees. Eventually, Joincus found a plateau encircled by rivers and hills, a landscape rich in iron and water. The locals called it Dardania, a name the exiles interpreted as confirmation. There, they founded a city, Scupi, or Sicambri, not as a conquest, but as a commitment. This was to be a new Troy. Not born in arrogance, but in hardship. Ancient and medieval chronicles frequently mention the Sicambrians as originating from the east after the fall of Troy, migrating westward towards Germania. These accounts place their migration in the context of large-scale movements of peoples in the wake of the Trojan War and the breakdown of earlier civilizations. The Sicambrians are often said to have come from a region called Pannonia, which became a significant Roman province, but the details can be murky and vary between different sources. In the case of the Sicambrians, a fascinating historical issue arises when we look at the potential confusion between the regions of Paeonia and Pannonia. Paeonia was an ancient region located south of the Danube, stretching across parts of what we know as northern Greece, southern Macedonia, and parts of Dardania. While Pannonia, on the other hand, was located farther to the north, near the Danube River, encompassing areas of modern Hungary and surrounding territories. Given their proximity and similarities in name, it's plausible that medieval chroniclers, with limited access to historical records and no clear geographical maps, mistakenly conflated Paeonia with Pannonia. These writers, many centuries after the events, were recording oral traditions or older texts that had already undergone misinterpretation. Furthermore, scribes in the Middle Ages often worked from incomplete information and copied older manuscripts with little regard for geographic accuracy. Hence, what was once an account of Paeonia, a region in the Balkans connected with the Dardanians, was likely miswritten or copied incorrectly as Pannonia, a completely different region. If we then consider the idea that the Sicambrians, as descendants of Dardanian survivors, were originally located in Paeonia, then we can see how this confusion with Pannonia might have occurred. Skopje, located near the Vardar River, was a known center of Dardanian settlement before it became part of Roman territory. It sits within the broader region historically linked to both Paeonia and Dardania. If some of the survivors of the Trojan destruction and the Dardanian homeland did migrate northward, they might have moved through Paeonia into the heart of the Balkans and eventually into Pannonia, or at least areas with similar cultural characteristics, remembered later as such by chroniclers. So, it's entirely possible that when medieval sources tell us of the Sicambrians migrating from Pannonia, they are in fact recalling an earlier memory of people who were originally from Paeonia, the region where the Dardanian exiles may have initially settled, and which later became linked with the legendary Sicambria. The connection between these two regions could easily have been blurred over time, and the misidentification of one for the other could explain the confusion found in the historical chronicles. Joincus selected the site strategically, a vantage point between the valley and the distant horizon. Here, he declared, we cease to wander. Here, we begin. Resistance was inevitable. Illyrian and Thracian war bands tested the newcomers. But Joincus used both diplomacy and defense. Some opponents became allies, others were subdued. Slowly, the Sicambrians, a name possibly meaning seekers of home, established stability. They began cultivating not just land, but identity. But Dardania remained volatile. Over the next 4 centuries, Skopje endured waves of conflict. With every new wave, the Sicambrians adapted. They recorded experiences in symbols and rituals, turning trauma into tradition. Governance structures emerged. Children recited ancestral names before learning arithmetic. Communities developed distinct textiles, hairstyles, and spiritual practices, distinct, yet rooted in memory. The local populations, descendants of Illyrians and Thracians, were initially wary, but similarities emerged, shared traditions of ancestor veneration, equestrian culture, and ritual fire. Over time, integration followed. The early years were marked by difficulty. Farming was hard. Disease took many. Winters were brutal. Yet, they adapted. Homes of timber became stone dwellings. Sacred spaces were designated. Children learned both their Trojan heritage and the customs of their new homeland. Over time, Skopje became known for law and lore, a place where smoke from morning fires rose into legend. And from this cultural fusion, a new identity formed. On high ground, beneath pine-covered slopes and near icy streams, they built Skopje. Its architecture reflected both function and meaning, inscribed with sun symbols and twin serpents representing Dardanian legacy. Recent genetic research has highlighted an interesting clue that may connect the ancient Dardanians of Troy with the later Dardanians of the Balkans, namely, the haplogroup known as EV13. Haplogroup EV13 is today most common in the Balkans, particularly among Albanians, Kosovars, Northern Greeks, and other South Slavs. Scientific studies trace its deep origins to a migration out of North Africa and the Levant, passing through a branch called EV22, and developing into EL618 and then EV13 in the Balkans. Possibly as early as the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. This raises important questions. Was EV13 already present among the Bronze Age peoples of the Aegean, including Troy? Could EV13 reflect a biological continuity between the legendary Dardanian princes of Troy and the Dardanians of historical Illyria? Some evidence supports this idea. Archaeological DNA from Mycenaean Greece, geographically close and culturally intertwined with Troy, shows a small but notable presence of EV13. The fall of Troy around 1200 BC aligns with a wider pattern of population movements known as the Bronze Age collapse, a chaotic time when entire peoples migrated across the Mediterranean and Balkans. Historically, Dardania in the Balkans appears in records not long after Troy's destruction, suggesting a possible survival or re-establishment of Dardanian elites or peoples in new lands. However, we must also be careful. No direct DNA from the ancient Trojans has yet been recovered. Other genetic models argue that Trojan populations may have been more closely related to Hittites and Anatolians, where other haplogroups like J2, G2A, and L were dominant. The major expansion of EV13 in the Balkans may have happened somewhat later, during the Iron Age. In short, the EV13 evidence fits the narrative of a Dardanian continuity, but it remains a scientific hypothesis, not yet a proven fact. Nevertheless, in the case of Joincus, the legendary Dardanian leader after the fall of Troy, the existence of this genetic and historical background makes his story not only possible, but even plausible within the broader patterns of human migration after the collapse of the Bronze Age world. Joincus remained a central figure. His burial site became sacred. His legacy guided law and leadership. His descendants didn't always rule from thrones, but through values, stories, and kinship bonds. The Sicambrians were no longer just exiles or descendants of Troy. They had become a new people. Their resilience was forged through geography and struggle. Joincus had led not as an aggressor, but as a founder. When he died, they placed his spear in the soil and made a collective vow to remember. The oath lives on in the stones of modern Skopje. Even now, you might feel it, not in sound, but as a deeper awareness. It hums beneath the call to prayer. It moves in wedding dances and quiet nods among mountain shepherds. Because the story of Joincus is not ancient in the way forgotten things are, it's still alive in culture and blood. The city he founded endures, not as a museum of greatness, but as an evolving signal passed forward. The legacy is genetic, historical, spiritual. Joincus, once a refugee prince, is now a remembered origin ancestor of the Arco line and of the modern Den Hartog family. I want to make something very clear. This series is not about simply claiming noble heritage, it's about asking questions and seeking answers. My research into the lords of Arkle and my potential connections to ancient peoples begins not from a place of assumption, but from an active process of analysis, theory development, and scrutinizing historical sources. When I look at sources like the Chronicle of Fredegard and other medieval bishop accounts, I don't just see them as records of the past. I see clues to a larger story, a story that connects ancient people from the Balkans, the Trojan region, and even the Sicambrians to my family's history. These sources are rich in detail, but they are also full of gaps and ambiguities that require us to think critically. Building on these medieval sources, I also integrate modern genetic research, particularly the spread of haplogroup ofthe, which connects to the Balkans and parts of the Rhine Valley. What I'm proposing here is not simply a genealogical claim. I'm building on scientific research that traces the migration of ancient peoples through both historical records and genetic evidence. For example, I've explored how ofthe seems to track the migration of peoples from the Balkans to the Rhine Valley. This aligns closely with historical theories of migrations that saw the Sicambrians arriving in Germany. The key question I'm exploring, though, is whether the Sicambrians were actually connected to the ancient Dardanians. The possibility that these ancient movements were miswritten or copied over time is something we must consider. It's easy for these tales to become distorted through layers of historical writing, and part of my work has been to sift through these discrepancies and reassemble the story. I'm not claiming to have all the answers, but I do believe I have uncovered a pathway to understanding how these ancient people fit into the broader tapestry of European history. I invite you to join me in this process of exploration. Let's examine the evidence together, question the gaps in the historical record, and see what we can uncover. In the end, whether or not we find the definitive proof that links the ancient Trojans to the Sicambrians or that the lords of Arkle can trace their origins back to these peoples, it's the process of inquiry, the questioning of assumptions, and the pursuit of knowledge that brings us closer to understanding who we are and where we come from. They say mountains don't forget. In the rugged highlands now spanning Kosovo, eastern Albania, and northern Macedonia, ancient names still echo on the wind. Beneath wheat fields and wild thyme lie stones inscribed with scripts long out of use. And in the looming presence of the Sar and accursed mountains, voices seem to resonate, not only in the daily life of the region, but from a world that once was. This region was once known as Dardania. It was the heartland of a kingdom with roots tracing back to the Bronze Age. Its people, the Dardanelles, were resilient highlanders, skilled miners, warriors, horsemen, and spiritual figures. Here, in what would become Skopje, the exiled Sicambrians, a people with legendary ties to Troy, found a new base of power. The Dardanian realm was never fully absorbed into the Greek, Thracian, or Roman worlds, despite being claimed by them at different times. It maintained its own distinct identity, a landscape of autonomous tribes. The Dardanelles and early Sicambrians shared critical traits, a warrior ethos, reverence for fire and sacred stones, and a social fabric centered on kinship and justice. Reputation was vital, betrayal, an offense remembered across generations. To this day, cultural remnants linger. Albanian Highland clans still refer to the canon, a traditional code of conduct transmitted orally through centuries. It enshrines principles of honor, hospitality, retribution, and kinship responsibility. Though fading, the concept of blood feuds remains embedded in the region's cultural DNA, linking present-day communities with their Iron Age predecessors. Languages vary here: Albanian, Macedonian, Serbian, but cultural patterns often overlap. Celebrations involve circle dances and ceremonial gunfire. Ancestral toasts precede meals. And beneath all this lives the persistent tension of borders and states that rarely align with the land's deeper story. Today's Skopje, capital of North Macedonia, stands above ancient Skopje's foundations. Roman aqueducts still stretch across its outskirts, and the city's archaeological layers reflect its long history, with remnants from the Ottomans, Byzantines, and Romans all visible in a single frame. The Vardar River, once a corridor of human migration, still cuts through the city like a flowing archive. Religion here also carries historical weight. Eastern Orthodoxy, Sunni Islam, and Catholicism coexist, layered over earlier belief systems. Crosses on hilltops overlook mosques, while shrines to saints may still carry faint echoes of older deities remembered in stone. Today's politics, nationalist sentiment, EU ambitions, cultural protectionism, are just the latest iterations of a much older conversation about belonging and legacy. When you listen carefully, it's clear that debates over language, identity, and land are not new. They've been ongoing since the day exiles from Troy sailed west, seeking a new homeland. To grasp the figure of Joincus, and with him the founding of Skopje and the Sicambrians, one must also grasp the nature of this terrain, the resilience of its peoples. When Skopje's influence waned and its people once again felt the pull of migration, a group moved north. They carried with them only their weapons, their heirlooms, and their name, Sicambri. They crossed rivers, forests, and wetlands, eventually settling in the regions we now call France, Frisia, and the Netherlands. Among them, through one enduring noble line, were the ancestors of the House of Arkell. Even now, when the Balkan wind picks up and moonlight spreads across the hills of Skopje, the old songs seem to stir again, as if Joincus himself calls from the past. By the time Julius Caesar wrote his Commentarii, the Sicambri had established themselves near the Rhine. Roman records describe them as a formidable Germanic tribe with a proud sense of origin in the east. Caesar fought them near Cologne. They appear frequently in both imperial and clerical writings, often invoked as the ancestors of the Franks. During the baptism of Clovis I, the Merovingian king, Bishop Remigius addressed him with these famous words: Midas depone calla, Sicamber. Bow thy head, proud Sicamber. Why would the first king of the Franks be addressed this way in 496 AD? Because the lineage had not vanished, it had adapted. To understand Prince Joincus of the Dardanian frontier, the first of the Sicambrians, founder of Skopje, and symbolic bridge between Troy and the Rhine, is to confront a layered truth. He is more than a myth, he is the first note in a complex Balkan symphony. His migration, from the fallen walls of Troy to the highlands of Dardania, resonates in every modern soul seeking freedom, roots, and purpose. So if you ever walk the slopes of Kosovo, pause and listen. The hills may still whisper his name. Because in Dardania, the rivers still run. And the mountains, yes, the mountains do not forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey into our shared past. If today's episode sparked your curiosity about where we come from and where we're going, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel. Search for Origin. Here, history, faith, and science come together to reveal the deeper stories that shaped our world. And if you're ready to walk in the footsteps of the past yourself, I now offer exclusive museum and city tours in the Netherlands and Germany. Discover the hidden layers of art, culture, and faith with a personal guide who speaks your language and knows the ground you're walking on. To book a tour or ask questions, reach out at dukes@tonline.de That is djoeks@tonline.de, or look at the information in the channel's description. Your origin story is waiting. See you all in the next episode.